All right, so this is a really special talk for me because this is about 9 years in the making. And if you don't know what I mean by that, you soon will. Um, at Yelp, first, before I go into the details, to give you an idea of the scale that we're at, well, first, our mission is to connect people with great local businesses. We do that with about 33 million unique app devices. Our group today, our engineering group today, is about 1,300 plus. My group is 70 engineers, two groups of about 9 teams. We didn't always used to be that way, and my goal today is to kind of walk you through that journey. It's pretty rare that you'll get to be part of that journey every step of the way, and I've been at Yelp for those 9 years. So what I'm going to attempt to do is walk you through 10 years of Yelp history, 10 years of the developer productivity group at Yelp in 30 minutes. We'll see how that goes. Each stage at Yelp has really felt like a different stage, almost a different company. And that's really why I wanted to break this down a little bit more for the group. You kind of see the end state or the current state of where the company's at, but you might not hear about the trouble that they had to begin with or how they even got started. And I thought this was like a really unique opportunity to just kind of show you what's inside the black box. So we started with, well, when I started at Yelp, we had about 200 engineers. And when we started the engineering effectiveness group, so we called it engineering effectiveness, not developer productivity, we'll just say they're interchangeable. We grew to 400 engineers, and then we grew to 1,300 engineers. There are many steps in between, but EE has pretty much, EE, engineering effectiveness, has pretty much remained about 10% or less of the group. My role has changed over time at Yelp. I don't have this here, but I actually started as an intern at Yelp. So I got out of the military, went back to grad school, and then went to Yelp. So started at Yelp as an intern, was an IC on the core web team. That was our first team in engineering effectiveness. I switched over to manage that team in 2016, and then in 2019, I took over the group. This, who's familiar with this quote? I feel like, okay, we got one. Really? One? I think this has kind of been lost to the sands of time, but this was a quote from Peter Seibel, who is an engineer at Twitter, leading their developer productivity group. And one of the things that he was looking at was, well, how do you figure out what the size of your engineering effectiveness group should be? And how do you make them as effective as possible? Well, Twitter had a bunch of different technologies. You could use whatever technology you wanted. And so there was this idea that you needed to start to centralize on a specific technology if you wanted your platform team or your group to be able to have the impact that it has. So the idea is that you have a lean group of engineers that can focus on building out paved paths for your broader engineering base, and that's a better use of engineering time if that centralized use case is used by a bunch of your engineers. And as all engineers do, there's a blog post on this. They got very technical with it, and they even plotted out kind of your maximum effectiveness as you created engineering effectiveness team. So my predecessor at the time saw this article and took inspiration from it. And this is how engineering effectiveness was born. And in fact, actually, we had a problem that we had to solve when this group came up. At the time, and just like any engineering organization, organizations change. And so at the time we were and platform is an overloaded term, but Here I'm going to talk about like web, mobile as a platform. So we had the consumer web team, the consumer iOS team, the consumer Android team. As you can imagine, that was not great for the PMs because they had to go to each platform team and say, okay, I want this same product feature on each one of these platforms. We changed that, but what had happened was we weren't really starting to think about solving some of the long-term problems that were coming up. So we had a lot of feature development on the consumer web team, and my predecessor went up to the manager at the time and said, hey, we have a problem. We have a problem that is going to start affecting us. And it was the monolith. I think every company nowadays has a monolith story. Well, we have one too. So we had hundreds of developers that needed to push code, get code out the door. We had a couple million lines of Python code. We had to do dedicated pushes throughout the week. So if you wanted to get code out the door, you said, pick me. And you got into the push. And then you were in the push with 20 or 30 other developers who also wanted to get their code out the door. Well, we would run tests, and we had a lot of tests, like 100,000 tests for our branches. And so we had a little bit of confidence that that was going to be a successful change. But over time, we would notice that there'd be a couple of changes that would cause errors in production. And my predecessor looked at this and said, hey, you know what? As we continue to scale, we're going to start to get to a point where every time we try to push to production, we're going to have to roll back. And that's going to be a problem for the business. And so that was the first problem that we took on at Yelp. And I think this is kind of going to be the key theme across my talk, is that, you know, I know there's a lot of talk about metrics today, and yes, I have that later on in my talk. But when we were thinking about the engineering effectiveness group, we weren't thinking about metrics. We were thinking about solving this problem. How do we get people out of the monolith? To give you an idea of the test suite for this monolith, if we were to run all the tests sequentially, it would have taken 2 days to run those tests. And think about this, 20, 30 developers running that test suite. And they're running it not just when they're getting ready to push it into production, they're running it a lot locally to test their changes. Now, hopefully they run a couple of tests to test their changes, but a lot of times they're just spamming that button to send it out and send it to the distributed system. So that was a huge piece of this. And so in the beginning, so yes, we wanted to figure out how to get off the monolith, but we still had to support the monolith. So how did we support the monolith? We did this in a bunch of different ways. We started thinking about distributed testing. Well, that was a pretty complicated system. You'll see that in the next slide. We started thinking about optimizing the build. The build took 40 minutes. And so think about a clean build. And sometimes when a developer didn't understand what was going on with the build or why it was broken, clean build. And you do that over and over again. How much time is wasted there? So we spent time optimizing the build. We had our own little distributed build system. We started to think about who owns what, because it was a monolith. It wasn't a monorepo. We didn't have great separation of code. We thought we had great separation of code, but we didn't have great separation of code. We had nothing to enforce that separation of code. We used get blamed to understand who wrote the code, but guess what? People leave the company, so how do you figure out who owns that code once they've left the company? It starts to become a problem, so we started thinking about this ownership problem. Pre-commit. My mentor, when I joined Yelp, used to mark up my code reviews because I hadn't really coded in Python before. I learned over on the Java side. And there was a PEP 8 standard. He spent a lot of his time just marking up where I wasn't following the PEP 8 standard. And then he was doing this for 2 developers, then 3 developers, then 50 developers, then 100 developers. He was actually quite good at doing this, but it wasn't the best use of his time. So that's when pre-commit came in. And that's actually an open source project. I think a lot of companies actually use that today. So solving complex problems like the monolith ends up creating very complex solutions. This was our distributed system for, we called it Seagull, then we called it Jolt. Don't ask me about the names. But the point is we were spending a lot of time for very little benefit for the group. And so this is where we had to start to change our strategy for the group and start thinking about how we could empower the group to do better and still push code to production in a safe way. So this was when we started to go into that service-oriented architecture era. And we also, at the same time, did some organizational change. So I didn't call out these colors before, but if you're familiar with team topologies, that's where these colors are from. Stream-aligned team, think of it as like a business unit. Enabling team, think of it as supporting a group of engineers. So web core supports all the web engineers at the company. And then a platform team, you can think of it as like a traditional platform. You have a platform that people are using or that may interface with. And so this is the setup that we had, about 300 engineers and 30 in EE. And so we started to think about how we scale. How do we have everybody operating in a service-oriented architecture environment in a way that was consistent? And so, you know, I'd like to say that we figure out all the problems, you know, before we went down this path. But you know what? We were figuring it out as we went. And you know, design systems was, and we didn't call it the design system, we called it the style guide. I think this was another one of those things that over time, there became better naming in the industry for these types of things. But you know, you go from one place where you have your code to multiple places where you have your code. You start to move stuff out of the monolith, and you go, okay, wait, I need the same styling here and here. How am I going to do that? And I remember my predecessor actually was starting to move some of the styling out, styled a whole page, and was working with his colleague and said, okay, all right, we did this page, now we need to move to the next page. And then they kind of looked at the code and they go, oh, wait, everything is namespaced to this page. So it's not portable. It's not portable from page to page. And this is kind of going back to like, we didn't call this a design system. We just said, hey, we need to have consistent styles across the board, and we need to do this in a way that, you know, we don't have to rewrite the code every time. We started to think about testing across boundaries. So when all the code was in one place, we could test all the code in one place. Once we started to have service-to-service interaction, we had to say, okay, how are we going to do this? And we were actually in the pre-1.0 Docker phase at this time, so we had to deal with all of those challenges as well. And in fact, Docker Compose at the time wasn't really a mature thing. We had one of our engineers actually leave Yelp and go work on the Docker Compose team. We ended up building our own thing called Yelp Compose because it wasn't reliable enough at the time for us to use that. And that was to spin up multiple services, spin up an entire environment to test off of. We had to start thinking about migration. So before we had a small enough team and we were supporting a broader group, we actually did all of the migration work for other teams. The consumer web team, we would just do the migration work for them. You get to a point where you can't do that anymore. And this was that point. We started to sprawl out to 40-some, we called them front-end services that actually had front-end code. We ended up getting to about 400 back-end services. And so we had to keep track of the migrations across all of these services. We needed to know how far we had gone. We had a tool called we used to call it Bumpy. Our little mascot for that was a frog. It was for bumping dependencies. Then we named it Yokio Drift, drifting dependencies. Um, and so that's actually what we have today, Yokio Drift. So we monitor all of the dependencies across all of the surfaces across all of Yelp, and we understand how far away they are from, what the latest dependency is. And we wanted to start providing observability to teams to understand how far they were off, how many versions behind they were from what was the gold standard. Because we were noticing teams were getting surprised. I want the latest style from the style guide. Oh wait, I need to go ahead and bump 6 versions up to be able to do that, and it has these dependencies on all of these other packages. And so this is, I think, the start of us starting to get better observability of systems. I called it like unobservable debt in the past because people didn't realize that it was a problem until they tried to ship that thing that needed that style, and they couldn't, or it delayed the project by a month. This is an example of Yokio Drift and an example of, like, say, bumping Gradle to 8.4. So you might have, so what we'll do is say, hey, these are the series of changes. So we have some automations behind the change. We'll go and make those changes to the code. Maybe there's a code mod behind it. And then we'll run the Jenkins pipeline, run all the tests, and if the tests pass, we might push it to production if that team is okay with going to deploy. We might wait and put that PR up to the team member to review that PR before they take it to production. I think the key point here, though, is that we put the ownership to the team that has this code. All we did was try to make it as simple as possible for them to make the change, but they were still responsible for this change. And that's a really key point because you have a very lean team, and if everybody's expecting you to make all of these changes, it's going to be an uphill battle for your group. And then, of course, as you got a sprawling of services, you need to start thinking about service templating. One of the tools I worked on was Developer Playground, spinning up all the services you need to bring up a local environment. We had this, it was a bunch of bash scripts for the monorepo, or for the monolith, and then we turned it into something a little bit more stable and reproducible across services. And then, of course, we brought in some modern tech stacks. So we were on the Google Closure compiler, which was kind of a problem for us because we couldn't really open source our code. Nobody would be able to use it. It's hard for us to ingest code. So we spent a lot of time figuring out a forward and backward compatible way of having libraries that would be able to adopt. So like service architecture, great. Use all of the new stuff. Use Webpack, use anything, use the latest and greatest, and we figured out a way that you could use the same libraries over in the new services as well as the old monolith. And then I'm going to talk about this over and over again because I think it's so important. We are able to help bring observability to teams because of the ownership view that we were able to create for the teams. And I'll show you what that looks like next. So this is really interesting for me because it's kind of a simple concept. Like you just tell your teams to put a YAML file into your code base and say who owns what. And we can add in entities, we can add in ownership for PagerDuty and a bunch of different things. And so this is actually kind of like the core, and I'll show a diagram later. This is kind of the core of what we rely on to get the right information to the right teams at the right time. So in 2017, we started to think a little bit more about metrics. So notice I started this at 2013, 2014. We're at 2017, and we didn't really start thinking about these global metrics until that point. So that's like something to think about, because I know today we're talking a lot about metrics and how you're using them for your organizations, and I think it's a good thing. You need to know what you're doing for your organization and how you're providing value. We showed that we were providing value through the problems that we were solving in an incremental way as we went forward. And so we show these metrics with a broader platform that we have internally, and I'll show you what that looks like. And then, yeah, we follow kind of what you see standard that's published today. Accelerates 4 key metrics, or you can call them DORA metrics, and then the space of developer productivity. So this is a page that a team might see, and we've changed this a little bit. We've added in some required migrations, so sometimes there's migrations that are really critical to the business's success, and so we want to make sure that teams prioritize those migrations. And then we also have a bunch of stuff that they can look at that are kind of quality aspects for the team. Do you pass your security checks? When you had an outage, did you write a postmortem for that outage? Did you actually follow up on the action items on that postmortem? So there's a lot of good health things to focus on with your team. And we have descriptions here if it's a migration that we're trying to do, and you can click in on it and you can learn more, and you can actually get instructions on what you might need to do for that migration. So this is where we're at today. About 1,300 engineers, 70 plus for my group, 9 teams. We have what I'll call the enabling teams on the top. It's interesting though, and you'll see WebCore has a platform as a service now, even though they support all the web engineers at the company. The other teams actually are kind of traditional platforms. Client data is our GraphQL service where you fetch data for use in product flows. Design systems, kind of a non-traditional platform. If you think about a platform being in production, the design system's not in production, but it is something that is a platform that developers are using every day. And this is kind of a picture of like things tying in. So everything is going into EE metrics. And we're able to provide a precise page for every team at different levels in the org hierarchy because of the ownership service that we have at the bottom there. And so a couple of things that we're doing today for our paved path. I mentioned the platform as a service for the web. We call it Gondola. We actually have a blog post on this if you want to learn more about it. We have GraphQL for our developers to easily access data across all different platforms. And we're starting to get into this like IDE, better IDE support for our developers. It's interesting because like a lot of our developers, when I joined, it was like Nano, Vim, Emacs, what type of user are you? Today it's a little bit more like VS Code is what a lot of our developers are using. So we can provide better support today for them there. And so the big things that we're focusing on today, well, we're looking at getting more adoption for our paved paths. We have pretty good adoption today, but you know, going back to that slide, let 1,000 flowers bloom and rip out 999 of them. We're not forcing people to come over to our platform. We want them to come to our platform because we think that that's a better experience for them. And so there's a little bit of a long tail there. And so we're constantly trying to get more and more people using those paved paths, and they are. And then I think a really exciting space, I feel like some people are probably going to roll their eyes because everybody's talking about AI today, but I think there's a really exciting space to explore here on how you can leverage LLMs to do code creation, to maybe reduce your your maintenance burden for migrations. So we have code mods that you can just like, you can say, this is the modification that I want to make to code. And then the question is, can you ask the LLM to make the modification of the code for you? And can you do that in a scalable, accurate way? So that's all I have, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you have.
Awesome. Yeah, that was an amazing talk, Kent. A lot of things I'm sure many of us can relate to. One thing that I've related to especially was the YAML files. Literally had the same exact YAML files for ownership. That was a game changer. Like, it allowed us to create dashboards for every team where they could see how they're doing on certain metrics, send Slack notifications, you know, tell them that they need to improve in certain areas. That's how like we ended up doing like a whole performance dashboard for every single team, and basically driving like, you know, teams to improve the speed of their pages. So it's 100% can attest to that one.
You know, and it's so easy to put a file in a repository and mark that owner, but then you realize you have the people problem. It's like, how do I keep all this stuff up to date?
Yeah, there is a good amount there too, where it's like certain files and file ownership and stuff like that can be tricky.
Yep.
But yeah, all right.
We have it down to like folder ownership, test ownership. We got all of that figured out. Now, there's some unowned things still.
Yeah, exactly. There's always the tricky ones. Yeah. So we have a ton of questions. I know that we only
fire.
Yeah, we only have a short amount of time, but Kent, you said you would be willing to hang out a little bit after, right?
Sure, yeah. So I can go to the back over there if I don't answer your question here.
Awesome. Okay, sweet. So the first one that I wanted to bring up is, how do you measure and quantify the success of your developer productivity initiatives at Yelp?
Yeah, and so this is kind of where this has evolved. And you know, it was interesting in the beginning of Yelp, we were more, I would say, bottom-up driven. And I got to a place where all the developers were happy, but then the execs were going like, okay, we think you're providing value here, but like, how much value are you providing? And it was hard to like tell that story. And so rather than go to metrics right away, I just said, okay, well, let's just take that product initiative and pair that with the platform improvement or the developer productivity improvement. And so the announcement was like, hey, we launched this feature, and oh, by the way, this was made possible and was sped up through these things that we did in our group. So that was one step. And I could go into a bunch of different things we were looking at. Like, I talked about build, 40 minutes. Well, okay, how do we decrease the build time? How do we decrease test times? How do we get rid of flaky tests? So many things that we could go through there. I think this is where I say we kind of have started to reach a more mature state today, where we are starting to look at broader DORA metrics for our entire engineering group. But we still might be looking at those individual proxy metrics and those qualitative metrics with whatever investment we're trying to make.
Got it. Yeah. I feel like you and I could talk about this forever because I'm on design systems.
Oh,
so
great. Yeah.
so I know, like, yeah, I totally agree. If you're able to not just say like, oh, we shipped this thing in a vacuum, but say, hey, we shipped this thing, and look, it's already being used in these product areas, and that your PMs are caring
what's your
about.
coverage in the product area right now? So what's the opportunity if we were to continue to invest in this space? So you do still approach this problem like a business problem, but I don't necessarily pull in a DORA metric when I'm having that conversation right then and there.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, man. Well, yeah, we are at the time, so there's definitely...
Okay, so I answered one question.
You'll at least have my question, too. And also, please, again, find Kent afterward. I'm sure he's a very nice guy. But so, what is one book that you would recommend to the audience that has changed the way you work or live your life?
You know, I asked ahead of time what this question was going to be, and I'm still having a tough time with this. I was gonna say the Fountainhead because everybody's talking about all these technical books, and I was like, okay, let's go non-technical here. So I might throw that book out there. If you want to hear the backstory behind that, you'll have to come talk. I think getting things done was a really pivotal book for me because I keep a lot of stuff up in my head, and being able to like think clearly because I have everything written down. It's such a simple concept. Really helps me be present in the moment. So that's super important. And I'm going to go a couple more for you because I couldn't just stop on one.
All right, one more. Come on, one more.
Okay, two.
All right.
This isn't a book, but I think Brene Brown's podcast, Dare to Lead, is a great one to listen to if you haven't already. And I really think a lot of the content coming out of from Will Larson has been great, and has helped me really kind of solidify a lot of the concepts that we think about in leadership, but just to kind of see that concretely written down has been super helpful. And there's a bunch of books there.
You and I are going to become best friends after this because I feel like our reading list is the same.
I have a whole reading list, so if you want, I can share that to you as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that is our.